Hey guys, how we doing? So today I'm going to be making this scientific looking kind of density map using just noise and volumes. Yeah, pretty quick one, nice and simple. Let's get into it. Just before I get into the tutorial, I'd just like to let you guys know that I do have a set of online assets that you guys can download. It's mainly Photoshop mockups and it's just meant to help elevate your work and just take it to that next level of professionalism. You can go check out my Gumroad in the description. Everything is free and publicly available for you guys to use and take advantage of. So yeah, let's get into the tutorial. Okay, so we're gonna do this on the fly. We're just gonna delete everything in the scene and add a plane. Then we're gonna go into geometry nodes, click new group input, delete our group input, and then add a volume cube. So what we can do now is we can add a volume to mesh, plug that in there, and this basically just meshes. This essentially just wraps mesh around the volume against that. But I guess the interesting thing is also this density factor. So if we add a noise texture here and we want to set it to 4D or even 3D is fine, it actually gives us density values from 0 to 1 in this volume, and we can map the range of this. So if we plug this into here, so if we just start pulling this maximum value down, it's gonna basically clip some of the values. And if we reduce the scale of this to something like, I don't know, 0.5 maybe, we get quite an interesting look, and we can actually like kind of reduce all of these values, and we can make this move over time by doing scene time, using that as an input and then plugging that into evolution value. And this will now kind of move over time in quite an interesting way, which is really nice. And we can even increase the scale to something like 1 maybe. That might be a bit more appropriate. And to get this to really feel like almost like a density map, some sort of like scientific visualization, we could kind of create a graph around this, or almost like an axis for this to be housed in. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to add a join geometry node right at the end, and we're going to add just a default cube, and we're going to plug that in here, and we're just going to hit pause for now, and we're going to see what happens. So we've got our cube in there. What we can do is we can add a mesh to curve like so, and then we can add a curve to mesh node and just put it back to a mesh. So we've got this profile curve information now, which is basically the edges. So what we can do is we can add a curve circle, and let's put this to like 8 maybe, 0.025, and then we can add that to our profile curve. So we're actually gonna add little caps, and that's basically that. I guess we could scale this up so it's a little bit bigger than the actual cube. You get this kind of look. So we could get a higher resolution just by increasing these by something like 64, and that's just going to give us a more accurate representation of that volume. And obviously the more you use, the better it's going to look, but obviously the more geometry there is and the slower it's going to be. So we're just going to put it to 64 for now. This is a good point to save what you've done so far, so we're going to do that. So now we've saved, we can kind of set the material for this. So I'm gonna add a set material here and also a set material. Okay, so we have our two materials. We're gonna go into our shader editor and just make a material for our wireframe. That's just gonna be an emission texture or emission shader. So that's just gonna be an emission shader, and it should look a bit like this. So if we go into our world settings and turn the color down to 0, it's gonna look like that, which is kind of cool. So now I'm gonna set the material of the actual volume. So I'm just gonna click it here for now and then select this one. So what I'm gonna do for this is I'm just gonna try and match the actual noise data as much as possible. So I'm gonna add a noise texture, and I'm gonna plug that into the emission. So this can also just be an emission texture as well, actually. So we'll plug that into the color, and we'll plug the emission into the material output. So we've got a scale of 1, and everything else is just set to 0. And if we set this to 4D, there's actually no scene time in our material network. So what we can do is we can just kind of keyframe this for now. So if we just set this to keyframe, so that's gonna set a keyframe there and go to the very end of our timeline. We can set this to something like 3 maybe. Let's see how that looks. And then if we play this back, and a good thing to do would be to set this keyframe interpolation to linear. So I'm going to select both our keyframes, right click, interpolation to linear, and it's still a bit slow, so I'm going to set this to maybe 5, see how that looks. That's definitely better. Okay, so we're going to go with 5. So again, hitting I, going all the way to our timeline, setting that to 5I, selecting our keyframes, right click, keyframe interpolation to linear. There we've got volume that's actually, you know, colorized. We can do a bit more with this, so we could actually add a color ramp, and we could then just use kind of a scientific color map, maybe to give it that, you know, extra scientific aesthetic. So I'm going to be using the Inferno color map. You can just find them online, there's quite a few of them. So for Inferno, our initial color is just pure black. So I'm just gonna plug in a map range here just to increase the intensity, almost like the contrast, if you will, just so we get a bit more of an interesting look. And it really looks like it's glowing right now. So we're gonna put this to -1, we're gonna put this to 2, so we get that contrast. So it could be interesting to turn on ambient occlusion or bloom, screen space reflections. We could even turn up our bloom to make it increase a little bit more, and just turn up the radius a little bit and see how this kind of glows over time and shifts. It's quite interesting. So this is looking pretty cool. We could also add another instance on points, and we could just use our cube points, plug that into here, and then we could use a string to curves node, set this to a font that we like, just give it some random kind of information like that, and then we can just plug that into our third instances, and then we can add another join geometry and then just add that onto the end here. So once we have our cube plugged into our points information and we have our strings to curves with some data, what we need to do is we need to actually add a fill curve node, and not that but here, and then we need to set the material of this, and I'm actually just going to use the same material here, and you can see they're very big and not really in the right position. So just going to reduce the size of this ever so slightly, and just going to reduce the scale instances here, and then I can increase that point. So we need a value to strings node, we can plug this into our strings, and then we can add a scene time, plug that there, set this to 2 decimals. You can see this is moving over time now. You could rotate this 90 degrees and maybe scale it down a little bit, and we can also just transform our geometry a little bit so it's a little bit offset, like so. Yeah, we could actually extrude our mesh just a tiny bit, just to give it almost like a stroke, so that when you're looking at it on the side, you can still see still there, you know. Maybe a better way of doing this, instead of offsetting it on the transform here, is actually to create another cube which is the same, and then just use this as the points information, and then just scale this up ever so slightly. And then you could even use the transform node here to kind of just move this down a little bit, like so, just to compensate for that typography. And yeah, this is your effect, your volume. It's quite interesting. I really love the kind of scientific look that it has to it. Just for final render, you could actually increase this to something crazy like ×4, which is going to be very large, but it's almost going to be to the pixel, so it should look pretty smooth. And then you can then animate this, which is running very slow, but it's going to give the best effect. You can also use a subdivision surface node if you didn't want to mess with the volume. But yeah, that's the tutorial, guys. I hope you've enjoyed it. Again, quite a simple one for me. I do enjoy doing these more simple tutorials for you guys, just to make something cool in, you know, a couple minutes. So yeah, thanks for watching, thanks for supporting the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.